welcome back to another episode of TPR Live. Today we are going to be talking about who and whom. Those two words that sound pretty similar but do pretty different things. So if you're not sure when you should use who versus when you should use whom, this is definitely one you want to tune into. So let's go ahead and start with our warm-up as we always do. Go ahead and grab something to write with, something to write on, and I will reveal these first 4 questions or sentences here. And you want to identify which of these 4 have errors. I'm not telling you how many actually have errors, but at least one of them does. So number 1 says, who did you invite to tonight's dinner? So just write down number 1, decide whether or not it's correct as written. If you think one of these sentences or whichever of the sentences you think are incorrect, just mark what you think the error is in each sentence. So number 2, whose laptop could this be? Number 3, Boz, who's a musician, went to a concert on New Year's Eve. And number 4, whom did you see at the courthouse? Okay, so I'll give you a few more seconds to look at these first 4 sentences. And again, we're going to come back to these at the very end, and I will reveal which ones are correct, which ones are incorrect, and those of which are incorrect we'll fix. So let's go ahead and jump into the actual content here. Looking at this idea of who or whom, and a lot of people find a moment of hesitation deciding, okay, do I use who or whom in a particular sentence? And there are some similarities between the two, especially how they sound, but they are very different. And because they sound so similar, a lot of people mix them up or just aren't really sure, never really learn the proper rules for using who and whom correctly. So they have very different grammatical functions, which we're going to be going into. And they're both pronouns. They're pronouns that refer to people or human beings specifically. And they can refer to one person, 2 people, 3 or more, both who and whom. So they could be singular, plural, and they can both be conquered. As long as you know how to use them and what purposes they serve, and if you follow some tricks, you won't have any more trouble with who and whom. So let's jump into this concept of who. Probably seen this word many times. And who is the subject. It's the thing in the sentence that does an action. It's a subject pronoun. I see we're getting a question here. Are the words who and whom so difficult to understand on the ACT? Placement of who and whom on the ACT. So we actually have a sample ACT question that we'll look at in a few minutes. And yes, they do show up on there, and they can be tested in some very tricky ways. So going to who, remember, who is doing the subject. Is doing the action because it's the subject. And it can be an interrogative pronoun, meaning you can use it to ask a question if you're not sure about who, a person or people doing something. And it can be with any tense. Someone who did something, will do something. So with who, you can say, who is feeling happy? Who is the subject because who is? And who can also be used as a relative pronoun. So your relative pronouns are usually referring to something. They're a pronoun. Anytime you have a pronoun, is replacing a noun or some other thing. And I see we have another question here. There are differences between how difficult who and whom are on the ACT versus SAT, following up on, I guess that would be Seth's question. So they're tested relatively similarly. The who and whom might show up a little bit more frequently on the ACT than on the SAT, but we have a sample ACT and a sample SAT question that purely only tests the who versus whom portion. Okay, so back to the relative pronouns. The relative pronouns would be who, whom, this, that, referring to different things. And a pronoun, again, it replaces a person or a subject, or it can replace another thing that's doing an action, or it can be an object, which we'll get into in a moment. So an example of who being used as a relative pronoun would be from this proverb here, he who laughs last laughs longest. So in this case, the who is just referring back to he. It's relative to that. All right, and keep the questions coming. So if you have questions that come as I'm going through this, feel free to type them in the comments or the chat. So looking over to whom now, whom is an object pronoun, so it's going to receive the action. And just like whom can be interrogative. You can ask whom or what person or people is receiving something as opposed to doing something. So you might say, for whom are you ordering that pizza? Now, that might sound a little bit weird because when we speak, we tend to speak not so formally. So you might have heard somebody say, who are you ordering that pizza for? Well, technically that's incorrect because it is an object. It's the person, the whom, is receiving that pizza. And we're going to look at a trick as to how to differentiate these two in just a moment. So whom can also be a relative pronoun. So we could say Joe, to whom we gave a pepperoni pizza, is a chef. So now this whom is just referring back to Joe. And if you noticed, a lot of times the word who is preceded by a preposition, like for or to, with, by. Not always is it going to have a preposition, and not every single time that you have a preposition will it be whom. There are some exceptions. So let's look at an instance where whom is used but not preceded by a preposition. So Mr. Pak, whom she texted, joined for dinner. So in this case, we don't have a preposition, but she texted this individual. So it would be the object of the text. All right. Now, so now you know what the definitions are. One's subject, one's object. Okay, great. But what can you do to sort of hack the SAT or ACT or any kind of writing situation that you're in? If you just can't remember what the subject or object is, you can use a trick that will help you. So one thing that you want to think about is the purpose of that part of speech. So who, it's the nominative case, it's the subject, it does the action. So does the word he. So does the word she and they, right? Your pronouns, your personal pronouns, you've got the ones that do the action and the ones that receive the action. And the ones that receive the action, as you know, are whom and him will also receive the action. And so does her and them and so on. But we're going to use he and him for this trick. Okay, so imagine you're deciding to say or write this sentence, who did you visit? Whom did you visit? Well, who did you visit? Whom did you visit? It might sound right to say who, especially because we're constantly making mistakes when we use these words. But you can use this he and him, him and he trick here. And you can basically answer this question by replacing the unknown, the pronoun, with he or him. So I visited he, or I visited him. Well, now you probably can hear the correct one here. You wouldn't say I visited he, right? You would say I visited him. And here's the reason for which we're using him and he instead of her or another of the pronouns, because it's easy to remember that him ends in M, and so does whom. So if you would replace the word, the pronoun, with him, then you're going to go for whom. So in the sentence, it would be, whom did you visit? I visited him. I visited her. And you see that there is no preposition before the whom here. So let's look at another one. Do you know who or whom left the trash on the table? Okay, we can use that trick again, replacing the who or the whom with the he or the him. So he left the trash on the table, or him left the trash on the table. Well, which one sounds correct? In this case, it's going to be he left the trash on the table. So since we're choosing the he form, that's our subject pronoun, that means that we're going to go with who, our other subject pronoun. So hopefully that's all making lots of sense, because now we're going to look at a couple sample first a sample SAT and then we'll see a sample ACT. So here's the sentence. This would be somewhere, it would be numbered, it would be within a passage, right? But anyone who's studying for the SAT and has been looking at the writing and language section, you know that there are little underlined portions and you might change something, maybe you don't. So in this case, if you read the sentence, Andrea would have to choose sides, for it was the villain who she loved. Okay. Now imagine these were your answer choices. No change, that, whom, which. Okay. When you're dealing with a person or people, you don't want to say that or which. That or which don't refer to people. So you could automatically get rid of B and D. But then you're down to the dreaded who versus whom, and you have to figure out which one would be correct. All right, we can use that trick I just taught you by using the he and him. It was the villain whom she loved. Okay, so you gotta get a little bit creative sometimes and figure out, well, how can I use the him and the he? Like, I don't get it. Well, take this part here, she loved. She loved who? She loved whom. Now we can replace it with she loved him or she loved he. And what do you think is the correct answer? You would say she loved him, right? Because him is the object. It's the object of her love. So since we're saying him, we would go with whom. All right. And then our sample ACT question. Very similar here. It's just another kind of variation. And again, my sample ACT and SAT questions are only testing the who and the whom. You may see things like a comma who and a bunch of text afterwards. For the purposes of this presentation today, I'm only focusing on those little words. You may see different variations and more than one thing changing. Quite often you will see more than one thing changing in your answer choices. So this sentence says, last February, my homeroom teacher, who has a PhD in mathematics, made a silly mistake. Okay. So who, no change, whom, which, that. And just like on SAT, very commonly the other choices you'll see are which and that because, again, they're all relative pronouns. So they're all just referring back to something. So just as we got rid of which and that in the first one, so too we get rid of it here since we're talking about a teacher who's a person. Now we need to do the who, whom differentiation, and we can do the he versus him trick. So he has a PhD or him has a PhD. And in this case, we would say he because he has. So there's a subject and then there's the verb has. So since we're going with he, we are going to go with the who. So this one would be no change. Hopefully that makes sense for Seth and Taylor and anybody else who's wondering how this might look on the SAT or ACT. And again, you'll often see a lot of other things changing. Sometimes you might see concision being tested within something or comma use or a dash or something else is going on. So as long as you got this part down, then you've got the who and whom part, right? And then you can focus on the other areas that might be tested within the same question. All right. So then we've got whose versus whose, and yes, you might see these tested on the SAT or ACT as well. So let's look at what each of them means. So we've got whose, who apostrophe S. That just means who is. It's a contraction. Just like he's, like he apostrophe S, she's, she apostrophe S. So it's going to be your subject. It's doing the action. So you could say who's going to the optometrist. It's the exact same thing as saying who is going to the optometrist. So it can be used as a question, like an interrogative, or it could be relative. So the lady who's picking up her daughter's new glasses looks very tired. So here, well, the who, not the who's the S part, but the lady is who's picking up the daughter's new glasses. And then the other who's, so these two literally sound the same. It's who's and whose, whereas who and whom, at least you can really push and articulate that M. But whose just shows possession. So you can have, whose glasses are these? To whom do these glasses belong? So you see the to whom. This is another way of saying the same thing. Or you could say the glasses whose lenses are blue protected Sebastian's eyes. So whereas who and whom pretty much always refer to people, you might hear people talking about animals as whos, especially if the animals are pets and have names. Technically, they could be it or they, but who and whom pretty much always refer to people, but whos can refer to people, it can refer to animals, or it can refer to things. So in this sentence, the whos is referring back to the glasses. It's the glasses is lenses. Okay. So same thing, if you're looking at an SAT or ACT question, you're gonna have that underlying portion and you wanna go and ask yourself, okay, is it who or whose? And maybe 2 answer choices will have the whos and 2 will have the other whos if you're getting tested on multiple things. So start there and look to identify, is it a who is? Can I contract it out if I read it within the sentence and say who is? Does it make sense? If not, then it's probably gonna be the possessive form. And then another bonus, how about whoever and whomever? So these are other who, whom situations. And sometimes you'll see whoever, whomever added to a sentence like for emphasis. People will use them. And they're not very commonly used, especially nowadays, but they do get used and it's good to know how to use them, especially if you're taking standardized tests, especially if you're in a formal situation or have to write a formal academic paper. Luckily, they are very similar to the who and whom forms, right? So whoever and whomever can refer to anyone, just people. And the same way that who is your subject doing the action, so is whoever. So you're just adding an ever to the end of it. Likewise, the whom and the whomever both receive the action. So we could say, whoever solves the riddle will win a prize. In this case, we've got whoever and whoever is doing an action, whoever is solving. So it's the subject. You wouldn't say who solves the riddle will win a prize. It's just not going to work there. And then let's look at an example of whomever. You can donate the clothes to whomever you'd like. To, so we do see a preposition here, whomever you'd like. To whomever. So whomever here is just saying like I could give the clothes to him. So you could play around and reword to do the him, he trick with the whoever and whomever as well. Since you're just lining up the him and the whom, if it was him, then you'd say whomever. All right, and then one last tidbit, you might see the words whatsoever or whomsoever, probably not in your SAT or ACT, maybe in a reading passage, but they're not really used anymore. Not too commonly anyway, but they have the same meaning. So whatsoever is the same as, or whosoever is the same as whoever, and whomsoever is the same as whomever. So if you get, you know, a fiction passage on your SAT or ACT, you might see it thrown into part of the dialogue, for example, or maybe an older text from history or science. All right. So now that we've gone through all of these who, whom, whoever, whosoever rules, it's your guys' turn to go ahead, guys and girls and everyone out there, to take a look at some more of these in action. So for these, we're going to select the correct pronoun to complete each sentence. Okay, so number 1, with whom will you go camping? Or with who will you go camping? See, Anita, you're still a bit confused. If you have a specific question as to where you're stuck, just type that in and Rachel will let me know. As we break this part down, this might help as well. So type in any specific question that you have. And now I'm waiting for that. We'll work through these questions here. So with who or with whom? Okay, we can use the he, him trick. I am going camping with him. I am going camping with he. Which one sounds correct with the he, him form? I'm going camping with he or with him? You can say with him. So since we would say with him, that means that our correct answer is going to be with whom. So let me just change my pen color here so we have a different color. So with whom will you go camping? And there's a preposition there. So it's another identifier that you might likely have a whom going on. Number 2, for who or for whom is the parcel? Okay, whether or not you know what parcel means, doesn't matter. Focus on what's going on. The parcel is for him or the parcel is for he. Listen to that again. The parcel is for he, the parcel is for him. You would say it's for him, right? So him is whom. In terms of purpose and function, they're both object pronouns, so we're going to select whom for this one. And number 3, who's or who's living across the street. So here's an example whereby you can expand out that contraction, the who's, and say, who is living across the street? Who is living across the street? Hey, that works, right? You can say that who is living across the street. Probably more likely you'll say whose because it's just, a little bit quicker to say. Therefore, the answer is going to be whose. And again, it's not going to be the other form of whose since it means possession. So you don't always have to use the he versus him trick. If you know the rules and you solidly have an understanding of when you're dealing with the subject versus object versus possession, in the case of whose, you can just go with your grammatical foundation and know which is the correct answer. Okay. Number 4, who or whom sings this song? Turn it around to make it into a statement. He sings this song, him sings this song. Which one do you think is correct? We would say he sings. Therefore, it's going to be who. Let me just grab my pen to circle that. So who sings this song? And Anita, let us know if you're good, if it's making a little bit more sense with more examples, or if you still have any specific questions. Okay. Number 5, who or whom will you vote for in the election? Okay, let's turn this around to a statement. I will vote for he, I will vote for him. Vote for he, vote for him. You probably can hear it with your ear that it's going to be him. Therefore, it's going to be a whom. So whom will you vote for in the election? Or you could reword this and say, for whom will you vote in the election? You see the for, that preposition is over here. Either way could work. And then another one, whoever and whomever in action here. So whoever, whomever wants to join is welcome. Okay, remember, just kind of pretend that the evers aren't there for a second and just think of it as the who and the whom. And then we can do the he and the him trick. He wants to join. Him wants to join. Okay, Anita, you're saying that whoever and whomever are confusing. Okay, so that's where we're at right now, actually. So hopefully this explanation will help you. And if it doesn't, let me know and I can give you another example. So again, we're just going to pretend that the ever is not there for a moment and replace the who with the he and the whom with the him. And just look at that first part of the sentence. He wants to join, him wants to join. We can hear with our ear that he is going to want to join, right? That's the right subject pronoun there because it's doing the action. So it would be whoever wants to join. Anita, does that make sense? I will come back to it if you have some more questions, or if anybody else, of course, has any questions, let me know. In the meantime, let's go back to our warm-up, which is now cool down, and let's compare your answers that you had in the beginning as to which sentences were correct or incorrect versus what you have now. So looking at number 1 again, who did you invite to tonight's dinner? Who did you invite to tonight's dinner? I mean, it sounds fine, right? And we think if we listen to our ear, it always works, but certain things, especially who and whom, and words that we don't tend to use as often, we tend to not be able to hear them with our ear. So let's do the he, him trick. I invited him to tonight's dinner. I invited he to tonight's dinner. I invited him, I invited he. Which is it going to be? We'd say I invited him. So that means him goes with whom. So this is incorrect as written. We would need to change the who to whom. Whom did you invite? Okay, Anita, so thank you. Okay, so again, if anything pops up, just feel free to type the questions in. And number 2, whose laptop could this be? Remember, the who's and the whos sound the same, so there's that. But we have a contraction, so let's expand it out. Who is laptop could this be? Sounds kind of funky. Who is laptop? That's not going to work. So that means that number 2 must be incorrect. And the correct form would just be whose, W-H-O-S-E. Okay, 2 more to go. Back to number 3, Boz, who is a musician, went to the concert on New Year's Eve. So we have who. Who is a musician? He is a musician. Him is a musician. Which is it going to be? We would say he is, not him is. So since we're going with he, we would pick the who form, our subject pronoun. Therefore, number 3 is correct. And our last one here, number 4, whom did you see at the courthouse? Okay, so we can turn this around into a statement. I saw him at the courthouse. I saw he at the courthouse. What's it gonna be? We'd say, I saw him. So since I saw him, we're gonna go with the whom form. And that means number 4 is correct, even though it sounds weird. And a lot of times when you say whom, it's a lot of extra energy to pronounce that M, and it might sound funny, but it is grammatically correct. So just make sure when you're in formal settings and doing the standardized testing and the writing thing and in school and everything like that, that you're using the correct form. And if you kind of force yourself to do it, it'll become second nature. Okay, so if anybody has any last questions before we wrap up for today, now is the time to type them into the chat box. But just remember, the he versus him trick is very, very helpful. And just go back and refresh. You can just look at a list of your personal pronouns to remember that the he is on the subject side of things and the him is on the object side of things, just as the who is the subject and whom is the object pronoun. Okay, so if there are no more questions, I'm going to wrap up. Thank you all for tuning in today, and I'll see you next time.